Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. The commander we're discussing this week, well, he's 4 colors, he's 4 mana, and he's forbidden from being played in Standard because he got himself banned. It's Omnath, Locus of Creation. Omnath, Locus of Creation is a 4-mana 4/4 non-black jelly bean. When he enters the battlefield, he immediately lets us draw a card, and then he gives us benefits for our first, second, and third landfall drops of each turn. On our first land, we gain 4 life. On the second, he refunds his own mana cost. On the third, he sends out a wave of damage. Note that he won't do anything on a 4th or 5th or other future land drops, but his ability does trigger on every single turn. As Omnath has collected more and more colors, he's gained access to more and more landfall payoffs, making his page quite a crowded one. He opens up space for those who want to play a blacklist landfall deck without relying upon Kineos and Tiro or a partner combination. A single fetch land immediately triggers Omnath twice, giving us a huge boost of mana to do some truly wild things. Alright, let's load up Omnath's average decklist into the Architect deckbuilding website, and as always, any swaps we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. Okay, so this list is stacked. Look at these cards. Landfall is a popular and powerful strategy, and its enablers are often very costly as a result. This can make it appear daunting to players, especially those who are starting out. So, before we get started, I want to highlight something huge here. Half of the deck's cost comes from its mana base. This average list contains 9 rare fetch lands. 9, which often go for $30 to $40 a pop. Not to mention all of the dual type lands flying around in here too. For this installment, we're going to do things a little differently. In the first half, we're going to tackle the list as it currently is. I want to take a look at Omnath's play patterns when he's tuned up as well as this to see how he can improve even when he's nearly at peak performance already. In part 2, though, we're going to walk through a more budget-friendly version of Omnath because not everyone has $50 fetch lands for their commander decks, and it's important to see that Omnath can still pack a huge punch, 4 of them, in fact, 1 for each arm, when on a budget, and the subtle ways that his play patterns shift when this is the case. That's right, we're going to have 2 deck lists for this episode. So let's get to it. We're starting off with the tuned up version. A 4-color landfall deck is pretty interesting. Having access to 4 colors, of course, means that we have our pick of the litter when it comes to the best landfall payoff cards from tons of different colors. However, 4 colors in a landfall deck can also, in some kinds of ways, almost work against or at least force us to work around some different restrictions when it comes to the landfall strategy specifically. So that's something that we have to make sure we are cognizant of as we are tuning up. The first thing that I notice about this list is that it only contains 37 lands. That's industry standard for most commander archetypes, but it's definitely too low for landfall decks. The second thing I notice is that there are only 11 basic lands. At that rate, we run the risk of running out of lands to fetch with ramp spells immediately. While a lot of landfall decks can get 10 or 20 or even 30 uses out of fetching lands with cards like Terramorphic Expanse and looping it over and over again with a Ramanap, this Omnath deck doesn't really have that option. We rely a lot upon those non-basics. Next, I survey the landfall payoffs we have, and it's tokens, tokens, tokens everywhere. Then there's a cool damage effect here from the Valakut Exploration too. Morag also gives us bazillions of combat steps, so even if he's like our only creature in play, we can probably take someone out with that. Pro tip, if you have trouble remembering how Morag's trigger works, think of his ability like the card Relentless Assault. You cast that spell after your first combat. Just like Morag, he wants you to play lands after the first combat. Beyond them, we have card advantage monsters like Aesiova and Temur Omnath to help keep us flush with cards. And finally, our spells are largely devoted to ramp effects and the odd removal effect that keeps us protected. Now that we have our bearings, I want to ask precisely what Omnath's role in the deck will be. Some landfall commanders serve the function of being the deck's card advantage engine, for example, while others fulfill the function of being the deck's win condition. So where does Omnath fall? There's a world where we try to build around his damage trigger by repeatedly dropping 3 lands into play on each and every turn. However, that sounds a bit grueling, and it's likely to draw ire from all of our opponents who won't give us enough time to really make that happen. There's also a world where we try to flicker or bounce Omnath over and over again. After all, when he re-enters the battlefield, he's considered to be a new game object, so his abilities can re-trigger. If we have a way to repeatedly get however many land drops we desired, plus some ability to return Omnath to our hand or to flicker him, say with a Deadeye Navigator for instance, his own mana trigger would refund that cost, and we could infinitely damage out the table when we're able to infinitely play those land drops. Or if nothing else, his Enter the Battlefield draw trigger would let us draw as many cards as we want. I'm not going down that precise road though. It just seems a bit, convoluted, and I want the cards we play in the deck to have a good function even if they aren't part of some combo. No, when inspecting Omnath to figure out what role he plays in our deck, I feel the answer is Occam's Razor. He is a legendary Lotus Cobra. He boosts us to like 9 mana on turn 4 or something, and he enables the rest of the deck to come out the gates at full speed. So, to business. There are some initial cuts I'll make right off the bat. Arcane Signet, move aside. We want our ramp to come in the form of lands, thank you very much. Genesis Ultimatum, you paired beautifully, or rather disgustingly, with Omnath while he was allowed in Standard, but here, we don't really need ya. And Phylath, buddy, you don't have enough basics to work with in this deck, do you? We'll bid you adieu. Speaking of basics, my eyes linger on that Murasa Rootgrazer, which also only specifies basic lands with its abilities. I will be cutting this, but it needs to be done with the understanding that this card's effects, in theory, are actually exactly what we're after, just, not with basic lands. In this deck, we can't necessarily rely upon looping tons of lands by raminapping fetches from the yard over and over and over again. I mean, we can for a short time, but it's a much less sustainable rate than other Landfall decks, because here we have a much more circumscribed number of fetchable lands to work with. Returning lands to our hand to play them over and over again is, therefore, a great way to get multiple landfall triggers. However, the lands we want to do this to will not be basics. So, instead of the Rootgrazer, let's use some simple common folk. Walking Atlas, Llanowar Scout, and Sakura Tribe Scout. Tap, put a land into play. Not just basics. This is important because of how they work with, you guessed it, bounce lands. The bounce lands can enter and then return themselves to hand. And did you spy that slick retreat to Coralhelm in the main board? Whenever we get a land into play, we can untap the scout that put it there, allowing it to lather, rinse, and repeat. We can activate Omnath's abilities every single turn if we want, but really the important part is that we get infinite landfall triggers this way for our other delightful cards. I'm also throwing Kodama in here because it has the same basic potential. We can flip bounce lands back and forth with each other, or whenever our Scoot Swarm creates a token, we can play the bounce land for free, return it to hand, and then the token will come into play and trigger Kodama and let us do it again, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and boots and cats and boots and cats, and this card's great. Now, you may be concerned that I removed the Murasa Rootgrazer and ignored the fact that it can return lands to our hand. Rest assured, I'm adding in cards that address this fact too. This is one of the ways that blue absolutely shines in a landfall deck. So Moloku, get in here. It pairs up with that Kodama in crazy, just absolutely crazy ways. Tap a land for mana, pay it, and bounce that land to our hand, create a token, and then the token entering triggers the Kodama, and we can replay that land and use this mana to return it, and oh my goodness, it's disgusting. And it's not like Moloku is a dead card if we don't have this particular combo out either. Replaying lands is exactly what this deck is after, because we don't want to get stuck with tons of landfall payoffs and nothing to trigger them. I'm also going to recommend another enchantment to go alongside this for the luxuriant Omnath players out there. It's not like a hugely expensive card, but I won't be adding it to the budget version of this deck. Trade Routes is another awesome enchantment to basically mirror Moloku's effect. Pun intended. It can buy back our lands too, or pitch them into the graveyard for us to play anyway with those Ramanap or other such effects. It's a really splendid little enchantment right here that keeps us well equipped and at the ready. We can't just add though. To add cards, we must make cuts. This part's tough, but the following cards stick out to me. Emeria Angel creates 1/1s with flying, which is cool, but all our other token generators just strike me as being more impressive. Scoot Swarm is exponential, for example. Gruul Omnath's tokens are absolutely bonkers. Even Zendikar's Royal has some sickening synergy with cards like Risen Reef and Teamer Omnath. I've been soft on Zendikar's Royal in the past, but it has synergy with the blue cards here that meshes really nicely with the other cogs in this deck. Emeria Angel, sadly, I just can't say the same for. Horn of Greed I've also gotten a little dicier on in recent times, especially after the huge influx of land-centric decks that we experienced after Zendikar Rising. The chances are no longer super spectacular that an opponent won't be able to take advantage of this effect too, and we don't need to give our enemies that type of opportunity. Real quick, I'm gonna chop some support cards that I'm not as huge on too. Explorer, for example, gives us an extra land drop, but the tuned up version of this deck already has a lot of other more sustainable versions of that effect. I'm afraid I feel kinda similarly about Growth Spiral too. I don't think this is a bad card by any means. I just think that when the deck is at this level of tunedness though, I see more sustainable landfall effects than these. Escape to the Wilds is another. I liked it at first, but eventually I decided that we might have to ditch this one too. This deck is full of seriously amazing cards. It is a room of 5-star cards, for serious. This one just happens to sometimes be a 4.8 out of 5 instead. Controversially, I'm also going to slice the Royal Elemental. I know, that's a pretty big deal, but hear me out. This is a good card. AC Ova decks, Teamer Omnath decks, they make great use of it for sure. Here though, it's competing with 4 colors worth of amazing landfall triggers, and this one happens to be the most reliant upon our enemies to produce powerful effects, and it's also the most answerable too. A single Swords to Plowshares undoes it, unlike our other landfall payoffs. We'll be alright here though. Omnath gets us rushing out the gates super quickly, so this is the deck that will most likely be presenting a lot of the problems for our enemies with how much value we're able to produce from all of our other landfallers, so we'll be okay. I told you, cutting cards from this deck is tough. Like, all of these cards are seriously amazing. I'm gonna add something in here that I hope makes up for the cards that I've cut though. I cannot believe that Stone Cedar Hierophant is still not showing up in landfall decks. This is a second copy of Lotus Cobra. This thing takes our scape shifts and turns them into a mana boost, especially since we have lands that produce more than 1 mana. This card is absolute insanity and it's like a quarter. Play this thing, seriously. Landfall decks aren't just about the landfall though, they're also about the lands. I'm gonna make a quick swap on this here Myriad Landscape. We don't even have 2 copies of half of our basic land options here. It's only ever gonna grab 2 tapped basic forests, maybe 2 basic islands. I don't like it here, and I would rather that we use Croson Verge. This card can get us lands that have multiple basic land types. Wonderful! Plus, it's a really funny way to get landfall abilities on enemy turns. Gonna level with you, I also just do not trust any landfall deck that runs fewer than 40 lands. Every land we draw is a payoff, so we need more of them. I want to include 1 more bounce land in this deck. We have the 3 green ones in the deck already, but I'll also include this Is It version since those are the next 2 most prominent colors. Bounce lands are a really important part of the soul of this deck, so I want to increase their density here. You have to be very, very, very careful about playing colorless utility lands in a 4-color deck. Those can really mess up your mana fixing, especially when your commander doesn't contain any generic mana cost. We should be cautious about adding too many of these, but at the same time, when the deck has this much color fixing craziness, I do feel a little bit more secure in adding some utility land powerhouses. The first is, of course, Kessig Wolfrun, which is just a win condition right there in the mana base, and a dang good one. Landfall decks aren't just good at making land drops, they're also good at making tons of mana. And the next one I'm adding is the one and only Ghost Town. This land can return itself to our hand, though on enemy turns. That's okay though. Those scouts and Coral Helm things that we mentioned earlier, they don't mind if we activate those abilities over and over and over again on an opponent's turn instead of our own. Oh, and of course, one last thing before we go. This deck does contain the colorless non-basic land Field of the Dead already, and when we're playing Field of the Dead, which counts the names of our lands, well, why not mix up some of our basics with some snow lands too? They count as different names, which makes it ever so slightly easier to trigger Field of the Dead, just in case we run into extra basics. And it's perfect timing considering Kaldheim is right around the corner. Alrighty, here we are with a super tuned Omnath list, one that can use a mix of fetches but also bounce effects to get repeated land drops, and whose landfall payoffs have lots of extra cross synergy with one another, and which has even more resources to utilize now. A link for this version of the deck can be found in the description below, so if you're working on a super pumped up Omnath brew, go check it out. However, the goal of this series isn't just for these super tuned brews, so now we're going to move on to the second half of the video. Let's address Omnath when he's on a stricter budget. As I like to say at the beginning of every video, our goal is to take it from a good start to a great one. And the list we've just tuned up is indeed based upon an aggregate of the data that we've received from player deck lists all over the internet. With that said though, that list isn't necessarily going to actually be the starting point for all of the Omnath players out there. Not everyone is putting a bunch of expensive snazzy fetch lands into their deck, for example, which is totally cool. Omnath doesn't need you to. Have you read him? He's insane. He doesn't care if he's on a budget, he's gonna do some crazy stuff. He's ridiculous. He got himself banned in Standard. So let's just get to the list. We're gonna start off with the same list as before, but with the following assumptions/restrictions. First, any card over $15 is out. The fetches, Crucible of Worlds, Oracle, all that jazz. We're not making this a strictly budget deck, we're just acknowledging a stricter budget. Next, I'm going to swap out some of the Ravnica dual lands for other dual type lands too. The Ravnica dual lands are quite typical for EDH games, but not everyone has the full suite that this 4-color deck would use. Heck, Kaldheim is releasing new dual-type lands at Common that you can use if you want to build this up on a budget, and they're totally gonna be awesome for color fixing. I trust you, the viewer, to find the land base that fits you most comfortably, and I just want to use this part of the video to highlight where the majority of the price in that first list was located, and how you do not need a $360 land base for Omnath to have fun. Besides, we can even add some more basic lands to give a little bit more life to our land searching spells too. Like seriously, the price of the land base now is like 1/10 of what it used to be, and it's still gonna color fix us just fine. Finally, almost every card I talked about in section 1 is coming back for a reprise here, with the sole exception of trade routes, since it's something like $6. Not the most expensive thing in the world, but also not the kind of thing we need to go out of our way for when we're getting a budget brew together. This also means I'm making almost all the same cuts as last round too. Even if we have more basic lands, Phylath is still messy. Arcane Signet isn't necessary. Genesis Ultimatum, we're fine without, etc. However, I'm keeping a few of them for sure. Escape to the Wilds, Emeria Angel, Explore, and Growth Spiral all stay. There wasn't room for them in a souped up version of the deck, but there is room for them here. Like I said before, these are good cards. They just got budged out when our cast of cards expanded to like 78,000 5-star applicants. And that leaves us with this new slate of cards to add to. It's not a strictly budget deck, of course, but it is possibly a closer approximation of where some players will begin when they are putting together an Omnath brew. So let's get tuning. Notably, we've lost some cards that aren't just landfall effects, Cyclonic Rift for example. To make sure we still have a board wipe, I'll add in Blasphemous Act here. In fact, in the vein of removal, I think I'll also include Broken Bond here. Destroys a thing, gets a land drop. Since a lot of those get an extra land drop every turn effects are pretty pricey, a budget version of this deck can supplement that need with cool spells like these. We could also possibly use more card advantage too, so I'll throw in an effect here that gives some additional synergy with this deck's mission. Return to the Wild Speaker can provide us with a card influx, or it can make our many token payoffs even more deadly. Next, I want to diversify our landfall payoffs a little bit. We have lots of tokens here, but let's find some other ways we can win in case an opponent shuts down our tokens with a Pillow Fort effect, for example. After playing several games with Jeremy Noel of Commander Versus, I am convinced that Obun is an underplayed bonkers buddy. Jeremy's Obun deck changed like maybe 8 cards from the base precon, and he regularly smashes people for 20, 30, and sometimes even 50 damage. Card's great. And finally, let's revisit that Coral Helm or Kodama Bounce Lands combo situation. You know what sounds really cool when we can repeatedly put lands into play over and over and over again? Automatic, infinite damage. Direct freaking damage. And even if the combo is out of reach, the damage from these cards really adds up. From tokens to big creatures to direct damage, our landfall payoffs in this deck give us tons of ways to defeat enemies of all different archetypes. And hey, there we go, our second Omnath list. And look how much more comfortable that price is. Seriously, that falls way more in line with the average price of a commander deck out there. And let's be honest, there are still tons of other budget cuts you could still make to this deck. And I defy anyone to try and say that a budget version of an Omnath deck doesn't still pack a huge punch. I hope both of these versions of Omnath have been helpful for you, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to share with your fellow landfallers, make sure you leave those suggestions in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.